Help me reach 1,000 subscribes. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every comment. Thanks. I never imagined that after 30 years of marriage, a lifetime share with someone I thought I knew completely, it would all end in less than a minute. My name is Daniel. I'm 62. And for 3 decades, I had dedicated myself entirely to a life built alongside my wife, Margaret. We met when I was 22, fresh out of college, full of ambition, naive in love, and she was a bright, commanding presence that seemed to draw every eye in the room. There was something magnetic about her smile, the way she laughed at the smallest jokes, the confidence in her voice. I fell hard, and she fell with me. Back then, love felt easy, passionate, unstoppable. The first 10 years of our marriage were a whirlwind of joy and growth. We bought our first house, welcomed our 2 children, and celebrated milestones like any normal family. I worked tirelessly, sometimes 2 jobs, to ensure that nothing in our household ever faltered. Margaret pursued her career in publishing, thriving in a field that demanded perfection. Yet somehow, she always found time to nurture our family. Those years were filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and small acts of tenderness that now feel like relics from a past life. But somewhere between the 4th decade and today, the rhythm of our lives began to erode. It was subtle at first. Little absences, a distracted glance at her phone during dinner, quiet sighs when I suggested we go for a walk. At the time, I brushed it off. Life gets busy, I told myself. She's tired. She's overworked. We're both aging. But it grew worse. The laughter disappeared, replaced by curt nods and monosyllabic responses. Touches that used to feel like home were now mechanical, almost resentful. The intimacy that had once been effortless became infrequent, cold, and calculated. I tried everything, gifts, compliments, planning small getaways, but each gesture seemed to push her further away, as though she were retreating into a life that I was no longer allowed to enter. The final straw wasn't a shouting match or a betrayal I could point to. It was a quiet accumulation of neglect. The silence at breakfast, the distracted sighs at dinner, the way she stared at the television screen while I sat beside her, waiting for a trace of connection that never came. I remember one particular morning vividly. We had breakfast in near silence, the clinking of cutlery the loudest sound in the kitchen. Margaret scrolled through her tablet, occasionally muttering something about the news or work, but never really addressing me. I reached across to squeeze her hand, a simple gesture, nothing dramatic. She flinched and I froze. There was the unmistakable wall between us. I realized, in that instant, that nothing I had done over 30 years had altered the distance she now maintained. My efforts, my loyalty, my sacrifices, they meant nothing to her anymore. I spent that day wandering through the house, lost in thought. 30 years. Every birthday celebrated, every Christmas decorated, every scrape knee kissed, every tear wiped away, gone. All of it vanished in the subtle cruelty of emotional withdrawal. And yet, I didn't feel rage or despair. What I felt was clarity, a realization that had been quietly forming in the background for months. I had been living for her approval, her acknowledgement, her affection, and she had withdrawn it completely. It wasn't just the absence of love. It was the absence of respect, of recognition, of presence. And I understood, with a cold precision of finality, that nothing could bring it back. That evening, she was in her usual chair by the bay window, reading one of her novels, completely absorbed. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but anticipation. Every step, every movement was deliberate. I set the cup down, walked the hallway, and paused. I thought about how 30 years had passed in a blur of shared routines, compromises, and unspoken resentments. 30 years, and in 30 seconds, it would all be over. I opened the closet, pulled out a small duffel bag I had packed early in the day, and filled it with the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my laptop, wallet, and the documents I might need. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic. It was just me, stepping into a life that didn't include her, for the first time in decades. I walked quietly down the hallway, past the framed photographs that chronicled a life together. I paused at each one. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, vacations, family celebrations, All moments I had once cherished, now frozen, distant, meaningless. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation, a bitter sweetness that I couldn't fully articulate. And then, without knocking, without announcing, without a word, I took my bag, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening air. 30 years, and in 30 seconds, I walked away from the only life I had ever known. The front door clicked shut behind me, and the sound seemed deafening in the quiet neighborhood. I felt the adrenaline surge, but also an unexpected serenity. Margaret didn't see it coming, and I wasn't sure she would even notice for a moment. I walked to the car, opened the door, slid in, and took a deep breath. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight lift. Not completely, but enough to breathe, enough to think, enough to reclaim a part of myself that had been buried under loyalty, compromise, and silence. I started the engine, and the hum of the car felt like a heartbeat returning to mine. I didn't look back. The porch light illuminated Margaret's silhouette for a brief second, and I saw her pause, book in hand, as if sensing something had shifted. But she didn't move. She didn't call out. She didn't even glance at the door. 30 years of marriage, and in 30 seconds, the dynamic had completely changed, and I was the only one who fully realized it. I drove aimlessly at first, the streets familiar yet strangely alien. Every corner reminded me of a memory. Late-night walks, hurried trips to soccer games, arguments over taxes, laughter over burnt dinners. Memories that had been intertwined with her presence now fell hollow, like echoes in an empty house. But the strangest thing wasn't the loss. It was the clarity, the sudden knowledge that I had reclaimed my autonomy, my dignity, and my life. I hadn't run away in anger or spite. I hadn't screamed or slammed doors or shouted accusations. I had merely acknowledged reality and acted. By the time I reached the little cafe near the marina, I realized that I needed more than distance. I needed space to think, to process, to breathe. I parked, sat in the car for a few minutes, and let the evening air wash over me. It was calm, unnervingly calm. I thought about the life we had built, the decades of shared routines, financial stability, family traditions. And I also thought about the subtle erosion that had led to this moment. It hadn't been dramatic, not really. No infidelity, no explosive fights. Just years of quiet neglect, emotional withdrawal, and unspoken dissatisfaction. And I had accepted it for too long. I decided to call my closest friend, Mark. He answered after the third ring, his voice cautious. "Daniel, everything okay?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment. Then I said simply, I left the house." There was silence on the other end, followed by a low whistle. 30 years? He asked, incredulous. In 30 seconds? I chuckled dryly, a sound I hadn't made in years. Exactly. And she didn't see it coming. That's the point. Mark didn't ask why. He didn't judge. He just listened, as friends who've known you for decades do. I told him about the morning, the silence, the flinch of a hand, the accumulation of small rejections that had led me to this. I told him about the strange mixture of sorrow and liberation that coursed through me as I packed my bag, walked past the photographs, and stepped into the night. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. He simply said, "Good. About time you did it." As night deepened, I found a small motel by the coast, the kind of place with creaky floors and the smell of the ocean in the air. I checked in, dropped my bag, and sat by the window watching waves crash against the rocks. The sound was both soothing and terrifying. It mirrored the internal storm I had carried for years, finally unleashed. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel fully, grief, relief, guilt, and pride all tangled together. I realized that leaving wasn't just about her. It was about me, my worth, my dignity, my right to feel valued and wanted. The next morning, I called my daughter, Emily, who lived across town. I wanted her to hear it from me before any misunderstandings could take root. She was shocked at first, then quiet. Then she said softly, "Dad, I'm proud of you. I've seen how unhappy you were." Her voice cracked slightly, and I felt both relief and sorrow. My children had always been part of the equation, loyalty, duty, love, but they also deserved honesty and clarity. And now, for the first time, I could give it to them without pretense. Over the following days, I began to organize my affairs. The house would eventually be divided, belongings sorted, financial accounts disentangled. But none of it felt urgent. The immediate weight had lifted. What mattered was emotional liberation, the knowledge that I had acted decisively, calmly, and without compromise to my own self-respect. Margaret reached out once, a tentative text. "Daniel, can we talk?" I stared at it for a moment, heart hammering, then typed back. "I think we've already said everything that matters. I wish you well." And that was it. No drama, no argument, no confrontation. Just quiet closure. Weeks later, as I settled into a small apartment near the coast, I realized something remarkable. The life I had known for 30 years wasn't lost. It had been transformed. I had reclaimed time, space, and self-determination. I could read, write, travel, and think without the constant, invisible weight of neglect and emotional erosion. And though there were moments of sadness, pangs of nostalgia, and flashes of guilt, they were tempered by a newfound strength I hadn't felt in decades. I sometimes wonder if Margaret ever understood the magnitude of what I had done. Leaving in 30 seconds wasn't just a literal act. It was symbolic. It was a message to myself that no one, not even someone you devoted your life to, has the right to diminish your existence. It was proof that clarity and courage, even after 30 years, can create a new beginning. And as I watched the sunrise over the horizon, golden light spilling across the ocean, I felt a freedom that I hadn't known I was capable of. The life we built together had ended, but my life, my true unburdened life, was only beginning.